Well, as we continue our series this winter on looking at the person of Joseph in the book of Genesis, one of the patriarchs of Israel, we are turning this week to Genesis chapter 39. And it's the whole chapter, but that just helps us to get really the story of what's going on here for him. And so I'd invite you to turn in your Bibles, or those that might be in the seat in front of you, turn with me to Genesis chapter 39. I'll be starting with verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story: "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. May God add his blessing to this word. Some of you know that last weekend, our Keurig machine here at the church quit working. It was just refusing to pump water through it. I told Ted and Nancy that I would look into ordering a replacement for us. After church, Ted usually gathers the garbage and takes it out to the dumpster, but he had his hands full, so he asked if I'd be willing to do so when I left, and I said sure. And when I was getting ready to leave, I picked up the bag and thought, this seems awfully heavy. Then it occurred to me, opened up the bag, and there right on top was the Keurig machine, the coffee machine right there. I'm a bit of a cheapskate. And I just couldn't bear to throw that thing out without at least trying to get it working again. So I pulled it out of the bag, put it in my car, took it home to see if I could get it working. I did a little bit of Googling and saw that I took the machine and held it upside down over our kitchen sink and applied a little percussive maintenance. And would you believe it? I Fonzied the thing into working. I ran some vinegar through it. It seemed to be doing it. Put a bunch of fresh water through it to flush it out. Cleaned it up really well. It's working great. But then I had a problem. Because if I took it back, Ted and Nancy would know that it had been in the garbage. And I'd have to admit that I went dumpster diving. And they were already expecting me to buy a new one for the church, and getting a new coffee maker at home for free sounded pretty good. But ultimately that didn't feel honest. And I'm still a cheapskate when it's other people's money, so I brought it back. At least Ted and Nancy are the only ones who know what I did. Ted told me that he intends to call the machine Lazarus from now on. But I think if there's a patron saint of coffee makers, it should be Eutychus. And if you get that one, you win Bible trivia for the day. But it bothered me how tempting that whole thing was. Just don't say anything. Keep the coffee maker. Don't admit what I'd done that was kind of embarrassing. And we're all tempted every day. Some are what we like to think of as small things, like telling a little white lie about a coffee maker. Maybe watching that show that we know really doesn't line up with God's values. Maybe it's fudging the numbers just a little bit, or giving in to the outburst of anger, sharing that gossip. But even the small things aren't really small. They all push us away from God instead of closer to Him. They all harden our hearts just a bit and make it that much easier to give in to temptation the next time. Now, by any metric, Joseph was facing a serious temptation here. He had been sold into slavery by his brothers, taken down to Egypt. Despite his situation as a slave, he advances within his master's household, only to find his master's wife making advances on him. But he remains faithful, even when it winds up costing him. I'd like us to look today at some things we can learn from him about how we can be faithful when we are tempted. The first thing is probably the most obvious, right? Run from temptation. That's the picture we get, the big illustration from this passage. Potiphar's wife propositions Joseph. She grabs a hold of his cloak, but he just leaves it behind. He just slips right out of it and sprints out of the house. It's almost a little comical if you really think about it. But Joseph doesn't linger with temptation. Notice he doesn't flirt back with her. A lot of people would say, it's just harmless fun. I'm not actually going to do anything. But as the book of Proverbs says, can a man scoop fire into his lap without his clothes being burned? Billy Graham famously avoided being alone with any woman outside of his family to avoid temptation, to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. And I don't know that we have to be quite that strict, but it is something I'm mindful of, both as a pastor and in my work beforehand. Be wary of closed doors, of temptation, of how things look. Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it." God will provide a way out. The King James version for that verse reads, "He left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out." Nobody else would get Joseph out. God provided the way, but Joseph had to get him out. But it's not just this sort of situation that we have to run from, that we have to flee temptation. Throughout the Bible, we do read that we should flee sexual immorality, the evil desires of youth, as Paul writes to Timothy. But he also says we should flee idolatry, pretentiousness, divisiveness, anger, and greed. Temptations will come, but don't linger with them, don't flirt with them, don't hang out with them. Run. That's not easy, is it? And sometimes it's not so clear how to do it. Joseph could run away from his master's wife, but how do you run away when you're tempted to tell a lie? How do you run when you're tempted to pride or to despair? Well, Joseph gives us an example there, too. We see that he was faithful in the little things. He was a faithful servant in Potiphar's household. He worked with skill and diligence, using the administrative gifts that God had given him. He may have been his father's favorite, but we see that that wasn't entirely unearned. Everywhere he went, he clearly had talents in leadership, in organization, and he put them to use, even as a slave in Egypt. He didn't have to do that. He had been unfairly sold into slavery. He was sent to a country with a culture and a language he didn't know, and no matter how well he did, he had little expectation that he would ever be free again. In that circumstance, we would probably understand if Joseph just did the bare minimum to avoid getting beaten. Why should he bless the man who bought him like property? Keep your head down, do as little as necessary, maybe find a way to pocket a few things along the way. But what we see is that in whatever circumstance, when he's obeying his father's directions, when he's working as a slave in Potiphar's house, even in prison, Joseph is faithful. And in doing that, by being faithful in the little things, Joseph has been shaping his character. Because the truth is, it matters how we approach the little things. The decisions to be faithful or not in our day-to-day life. That's what builds our habits, what builds our work ethic, what builds our character. When we hit send on that email without waiting to cool down, it affects our relationships with our coworkers. When we reach for our phone first thing in the morning to scroll social media instead of taking a moment to pray or to read a devotional, that sets the tone for our day. When we indulge the downward spiral of our thoughts toward fear or pride or guilt, instead of taking it to God, instead of focusing on His goodness and His grace and His glory, that starts to deform our spirit. Anytime we read about a major scandal, a political figure who's convicted of corruption, or a pastor who's brought down by infidelity, that big bribe or the start of the affair, those weren't the first steps. There were probably thousands of opportunities to say no to unfaithfulness and yes to faithfulness, but they steadily chose the wrong path. And every choice made it that much easier to take the next step downward. As Jesus said in Luke chapter 16, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. Joseph was faithful with a little, and that built his character so that it was easier for him to be faithful in the big things. But how do we do that? Well, when Potiphar's wife propositions Joseph, we can look at his response and see three powerful lessons, I think, in what he says to her. The first of these is to count our blessings, because that's the first thing he does. He talks about how he has been blessed. With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. Now, it's possible that Joseph felt no attraction to Potiphar's wife. Regardless of what she looked like, we really see her character is pretty ugly. But most likely there really was temptation there for him. Joseph was a guy in his 20s at this point. He wasn't married, probably wasn't in any kind of relationship. That didn't look likely to change anytime soon. As humans, we are most tempted when we're discontent. And our enemy knows this. He tempted Eve in the garden by getting her to focus on the one thing she shouldn't do, the knowledge she didn't have. He tried to tempt Jesus when he was starving to use his power to serve himself. He will tempt you with that area of your life where you feel most dissatisfied, and we all have that area in our lives. But notice Joseph doesn't focus on his discontent. He doesn't indulge his thoughts by telling her, I'm really honored. I would love to if only we could. No. He focuses on God's blessings. Look at everything I've been given. Look at the responsibility I've been entrusted with. Look at the respect I've earned from your husband. When we focus on the good things God has given us, it builds contentment and gratitude. It makes the temptation less tempting. But it's so easy for us to forget those blessings. Psalm 106 talks about Israel's experience in the Exodus. It says, he saved them from the hand of the foe, from the hand of the enemy he redeemed them. The waters covered their adversaries, not one of them survived. Then they believed his promises and sang his praise, but they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his plan to unfold. Like Israel, it's so easy for us to forget his goodness. We can forget what he's done for us, and we get complacent, we get impatient, we get discontent. Or we can count our blessings. We can intentionally focus on his goodness, remember what he has done, and we'll find patience and grace to wait on him. So we count our blessings, but we also need to count the cost. Sin is fun. A lot of the time it feels good. There wouldn't be any temptation otherwise, right? Giving in to sexual temptation or to gluttony or to drunkenness, it's a temptation because they feel good, at least in the moment. There's a thrill to feeling like you're getting away with something. There's a short-term comfort in avoiding conflict by telling a lie. There's even a perverse sort of pleasure in focusing on all the negatives about your life. I know I'm not the only one who indulges that sometimes. It's not new. One of the ancient biblical proverbs says, "Stolen water is sweet. Food eaten in secret is delicious." Sin can be fun in the moment, but it has its consequences. The bill always comes due. Joseph realized that. as he focused on the blessings he was experiencing in Potiphar's household, the clear implication is, this is what I would be throwing away. And even when the consequences aren't quite so clear-cut, there are still costs. Sin erodes relationships. Sin damages my character. It pushes me farther from God and from the person he made me to be. As the Apostle James says, sin leads to death. Potiphar's wife tempted Joseph with consequence-free sin. None of the other slaves are around. She's not going to tell her husband. Nobody needs to know. It'll be our little secret. But there are no secrets. Sin will be found out, or it will eat away at your soul until you're hollow and empty. Count the cost. The third thing we see from Joseph is to keep God in view. In his response to Potiphar's wife, Joseph also reminds us that we need to keep God in view when we are tempted. He says to her, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Does that strike any of the rest of you as curious? Because he's just gotten through listing all of the ways that Potiphar has trusted him, but he doesn't say, how could I sin against Potiphar? How could I sin against your husband? It's how could I sin against God? The important truth that Joseph expresses here is that all sin, first and foremost, is against God. It's saying, God, I don't trust you. I don't love you. I don't care what you think. I'm going to do life my way. King David expressed this same truth after his abuse of power when he committed adultery and murder and tried to cover the whole thing up. He prayed to God in Psalm 51, "Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight." Now, David clearly knew he had sinned against Bathsheba and against her husband. He knew that his sin had consequences for his family, in fact, for the entire nation. But he also knew that our sin is always primarily against God. Pastor Jeff and I were talking a couple of weeks ago as he was preparing his message on this passage, and he brought up an interesting point to me. How did Joseph know that this was a sin against God? Because in fact, in Joseph's whole story up to this point, this is the very first time he has even named God. Joseph's family claimed to follow God, but they did kind of a poor job of it, didn't they? His dad, Jacob, was a swindler who was always trying to get the upper hand. He had 4 wives, played favorites. Joseph's brothers committed incest and vengeful murder. They sold him into slavery. His brother Judah had no qualms about going into a prostitute. And within Joseph's context of slavery, well, it was common for owners to take sexual advantage of their slaves. Usually this was male owners against female slaves or boys, but in some places and times it was also common for women slave owners to do the same with male slaves. What Potiphar's wife was proposing may have been more or less morally acceptable in Egypt. So when exactly did Joseph get this moral education that adultery with Potiphar's wife would be a sin against God? Some of it, I think, was that he paid attention to the image of God that's been pressed on each of our hearts. Paul writes in the book of Romans, "What may be known about God is plain to them," all people, "because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Now our conscience is broken by our separation from God. That's what Paul is referring to here in part. We need to be careful, because just following your heart doesn't mean you're doing the right thing. And just because you want to do something doesn't mean that it's good. But flawed as it may be, our conscience is still there. It's part of God's grace to humanity. And if something feels wrong, it's probably worth paying attention. But what we also see is the reality that God's truth doesn't come into our lives for nothing. His word does not return to him empty. And he can use even flawed vessels to share it with us. Jacob was a flawed communicator of God's truth to his family. He was a flawed follower of God's truth. And that had consequences for himself and for his family. But for all of his failures, God's grace still worked through him. There was still a kernel of God's truth that came back to Joseph in Egypt and helped him to stay faithful in the middle of temptation. Parents, maybe you realize this morning that you haven't done the best job of sharing or living out your faith with your kids. And now they're out on their own, and you don't know what kind of decisions they're making. Or maybe you know what kind of decisions they're making. But don't give up hope. Don't give up praying for them. Don't be too proud to apologize or think that it's too late to share about your own walk with Jesus with gentleness and respect. Joseph reminds us that it's never too late. And Joseph shows us that it's never too late for us to start listening to God's prompting. The beauty of the gospel is this, that we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Jesus understands. He knows the temptation that you and I face, the big things and the little things. And he knows that we are weak. We can't do it on our own. He went to the cross for you and for me, for all of the ways that you and I have been unfaithful. And because of his sacrifice, because of his love for us, he wants to give us the mercy of his forgiveness and the grace to help us stand in our time of need. It's not too late to start doing the right thing. It's not too late to start following his will for your life. If you're still breathing, it's not too late to look to him and to start calling on his name. One last thing we see in Joseph's story is that we need to be faithful even if it costs you. Because this doesn't end real great for Joseph, does it? Even though he did everything right, he's still accused of assault and sent to prison. Faithfulness didn't seem to end too well for Jesus either, did it? Even though he did everything right, even though he never sinned, he died on that cross. Sometimes we suffer even though we do the right thing. Sometimes we suffer for doing the right thing. Do the right thing anyway. Peter wrote to the church and to us, But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats, do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Joseph was in prison, but God wasn't done with him yet. Joseph still hoped in God, in the long-term wisdom of being faithful to him. And his administrative gifts, his character, his faithfulness, they began to make a difference, even in prison. So I want to ask this morning, how are you being tempted today? Joseph reminds us to be faithful, even in what seem like the little things. Count your blessings and the cost. Keep your eyes on God. Run from temptation into his embrace. Approach the throne of grace with confidence so that you may receive mercy and find grace to help you in your time of need.